She was just an ordinary waitress, quietly working in an upscale restaurant where expensive fake smiles appeared far more often than genuine compassion. On that fateful day, when an elderly woman collapsed in the middle of the crowded dining hall, and everyone either laughed or looked away, she was the only one who ran to help. What Grace Whitaker didn't know was that the frail old woman she helped was the mother of the most powerful crime boss in the city, and that one small act of kindness would pull her into a world brimming with danger, where she would have to prove she wasn't a threat, or pay for it with her life. Grace began her evening shift at Hayden's Prime like she always did, with her uniform crisply ironed, her hair neatly pinned in a bun, and her black rubber shoes worn down at the heels from too many long shifts. The restaurant sat in the heart of Chicago's River North district, serving wealthy businessmen, politicians holding secret lunches, and the occasional local TV personality. It was the kind of place where a single salad could cost as much as Grace's rent for an entire week. But to her, it was just a job repetitive, exhausting, and the only thing keeping her afloat. In the kitchen, the rhythm of knives chopping, blenders whirring, and the head chef barking orders formed the daily soundtrack. Among her coworkers, Marcus, the lead server, was the kind of man who treated humiliating others as a privilege. He constantly mocked customers behind their backs and never missed a chance to sneer at a colleague who slipped up or moved too slowly. "Try not to spill again, Grace. The picky lady's at table 14 today," Marcus said with a half smirk, glancing at the tray in her hands. She nodded without a word. Silence was always the safest way to survive here. Derek, the shift manager. That was different, but in a way that was no better. He wasn't cruel. He was cold. To him, brand image mattered more than the people behind the aprons. Grace remembered vividly the day a female coworker fainted in the break room from exhaustion, and Derek scolded her for affecting productivity. Compassion, in people like him, was a luxury long forgotten. The lunch rush was always relentless. Grace moved between tables with practiced speed, smiling on cue, refilling water glasses, maneuvering through the narrow gaps between chairs. She remembered every regular's name, their favorite dishes, even their food allergies, yet no one ever remembered hers. To them, she was just the brunette waitress, or the girl who brings the medium-rare steak. Her life was a dull but predictable loop. Mornings began with cheap coffee. Afternoons were spent serving meals to people she'd never be invited to dine with. Nights ended in a cramped apartment above a laundromat. She had no close friends in the city, no one waiting for her at home. The dreams she once had of a bigger life had long been replaced by bills and rotating shifts. But through it all, she held on to one thing: kindness. Wherever she went, Grace couldn't help but help others. Marcus had once called her the nun of the restaurant when she stooped to pick up a dropped spoon for a little girl or offered a napkin to an elderly man whose hands trembled. But she didn't care. Her mother used to tell her, "You can't control how people treat you, but you can always control how you treat them." Grace kept that saying close to her heart, like a compass guiding her through the noise. What she didn't realize was that this very kindness, the thing she thought was just simple courtesy, would become the key that opened the door to a world where every choice carried a price. A world where kindness was no longer just an act of decency, but a test of survival. And it all began with one harmless fall. In the bright-lit lobby of a restaurant where no one else bothered to care, the sharp sound of shattering glass broke through the midday clatter, freezing the entire restaurant for a heartbeat. Grace turned abruptly. The tray of water still balanced in her hands, and that was when she saw her. An elderly woman, her silver hair neatly pinned, wearing an elegant ash-gray fur coat, lay crumpled on the polished marble floor in the middle of the main hall. Her leather handbag had burst open, scattering cosmetics, tissues, and a small bottle of pills across the tiles. The whole scene lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt suspended in time. Diners at nearby tables turned their heads, a few covered their mouths. But no one moved. Behind Grace, Marcus chuckled under his breath and said mockingly, "Night's performance. Grandma, who let the Oscars into the restaurant. Another server." Chelsea muttered, "She's probably drunk." Great. Another mess to clean up. Derek, the manager, gave the scene a fleeting glance before turning away, offering new gesture. No instruction. Everyone stood there, detached, as if watching a performance that had nothing to do with them. Grace didn't think. Instinct pushed her forward. She set the tray down on the nearest table and hurried toward the fallen woman. Her rubber shoes slipped slightly on the glossy floor, but she caught her balance and dropped to her knees beside the woman, whose thin arm trembled as she tried to lift herself. Please don't try to stand up on your own. Ma'am, let me help you, Grace said softly, her tone as gentle as when she used to speak to her grandmother. The old woman's eyes met hers watery, but with a strange glimmer inside. In that brief instant, Grace didn't see frailty. She saw something buried deeper, like steel hidden beneath fragile skin. You're very kind, the woman murmured, forcing a faint, shaky smile. What's your name? Dear Grace slipped an arm under her, helping her rise slowly and carefully. Grace Whitaker. She guided the woman toward a quiet corner near the window, where the late autumn sunlight fell in soft, golden patches. Around them, diners returned to their meals, as if the incident had been nothing more than a brief interruption in the expensive experience they had paid to enjoy. Grace took a napkin from her apron and gently wiped the dust from the woman's wrinkled hands, then knelt to pick up the scattered belongings: an expensive lipstick, a miniature bottle of perfume, a small photograph with a creased edge. As she was about to place them back in the handbag, the woman rested a frail hand on her wrist. Thank you, Grace. There aren't many who still understand kindness. I just did what anyone should do. Grace replied with a small smile, then added softly, Would you like something to drink? Maybe a cup of tea. It's on me. From behind the bar, Derek frowned, raising his voice. He called out, Ma'am, if you're unwell or under the influence, I'll have to ask you to leave the restaurant. Grace looked up, her gaze sharper than usual. She's not drunk. She slipped because the floor was freshly polished. Derek's face flushed, but he said nothing more, perhaps stunned that a waitress like Grace had dared to speak up in front of everyone. The old woman sat quietly, her hand clutching the edge of the napkin, her eyes drifting toward the window. For the next hour, she ordered only a small bowl of chicken soup and sipped it slowly, while Grace stopped by from time to check on her. The others whispered behind her back, half curious, half scornful, probably faking it for sympathy. Chelsea whispered to Marcus, That coat looks pricey, but it could be fake. 2. Grace heard every word but chose silence. At exactly 3:45, as Grace was clearing dishes from table 6, she heard a low male voice ask, Who's that girl? The tone was deep, commanding, with an edge that silenced idle chatter. Grace couldn't catch the reply, but she felt the sudden heaviness that settled over the restaurant, the way the air thickened as glances shifted toward the entrance. Outside, the steady hum of engines approached. Not one, but 3 black SUVs pulled up in perfect alignment, blocking the front of Hayden's Prime. Their headlights flicked off, yet no doors opened. Grace froze, the tray in her hands trembling slightly. She didn't know it then, but her life was about to change forever, all because she chose to kneel beside a woman lying helpless on a cold marble floor, and reach out a hand when everyone else turned away. A sharp click echoed through the restaurant as the front glass doors swung open, not by wind, nor by a hurried customer, but by a man in a black suit, broad-shouldered, eyes cold and cutting. He stepped in first. 2 others followed, dressed the same, moving with the same quiet precision, their silence trained, deliberate, predatory. The servers nearest the door instinctively stepped back. Chelsea dropped the water pitcher in her hands, and it shattered at her feet, water spreading across the floor, yet no one bent down to clean it. In a matter of seconds, the air thickened, congealed. The first man strode toward the center of the dining room, where Maggie still sat, calm and composed, slowly stirring her spoon in a bowl of soup gone cold. Derek, the floor manager, rushed forward, forcing a strained, nervous smile. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but we're about to close for midday cleaning. If you haven't made a reservation..." I'm afraid he never finished. The man in front looked straight into his eyes, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Lock the doors." The words were quiet, almost polite, yet they hit the air like an order. No one dared question. Derek stammered. I'm sorry. What do you lock?" "The doors," the man repeated, softer this time and somehow far more menacing. One of his companions turned immediately, slid the bolt shut, and pulled the blinds down. The daylight vanished, replaced by the dim, suffocating glow of yellow ceiling lamps. The space seemed smaller now, airless, sealed tight. Grace stood frozen at the far end of the room, still clutching her cleaning cloth, her knuckles white from tension. Every gaze in the restaurant shifted toward one spot, the table where the old woman sat. The same woman who, only minutes ago, had been dismissed as a troublesome old lady. She placed her spoon down, rose slowly, and in that moment, as if by magic, the frailness from before disappeared. She no longer needed support, nor did she tremble. With measured grace, she walked toward the center of the room where the three suited men waited, and stopped, under the stunned eyes of everyone present. She turned, scanning each face. "Chelsea, Marcus, Derek," one by one. "My name," she said, her voice calm but clear enough for every syllable to land, "is Margaret Callahan." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that swallows sound whole. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Anyone living in Chicago had heard it, not from official reports, but in whispers, through backroom conversations among businessmen, politicians, and in the dark corners of bars where power changed hands without signatures. Callahan wasn't just a name, it was an empire. Docks, shipping lines, construction firms, and countless other things people preferred not to name aloud. And at the center of that web sat Aidan Callahan, Margaret's only son, known across the city as the man no one dares refuse. Grace heard someone exhale sharply, as if punched in the chest. Chelsea whispered, "Oh my God, it's her." Marcus stepped back, his face drained of color. Derek said nothing, but his whole body went rigid. Madgie, or rather, Margaret Callahan looked directly at them, her expression serene yet glacial. "I came to this restaurant," she said, "because my late husband used to love the beef Wellington here. But today, I've learned something far more important about this place." The door opened again. This time, a different man entered it. No need for introductions. No badges. Everyone knew who he was the moment they saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark gray suit tailored to perfection, his chestnut hair neatly combed back, temples lightly silvered, but it was his eyes sharp, unyielding, the kind that stripped away pretenses that made the air grow heavier still. Aidan Callahan. He didn't speak as he entered. He simply looked at his mother. She gave a small nod toward the manager's office. "Security footage," Aidan said. "From 1 o'clock until now." Derek stiffened, his throat working soundlessly. But he didn't argue. Moments later, inside the staff room, they all stood watching the playback from the moment Margaret collapsed on the floor. Through the laughter, the indifference, the sidelong glances until Grace appeared, rushing forward, kneeling, helping her up, gathering her scattered things, guiding her gently to a seat. Aidan watched the entire clip without blinking. When it ended, he turned and pointed. "One by one. You, and you, fired. No references. And if any of you speak to the press, even one word, the consequences will not stop at unemployment." No one protested. They left like ghosts, stripped of arrogance, their silence heavier than shame. Only Grace remained, standing in the corner of the room, clutching her apron, unsure if she should stay or go. Her heart pounded, but her body wouldn't move. Then Aidan Callahan turned to her. For a long moment, he said nothing, just looked. His gaze was deep, unreadable, like a night without a moon. And then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded once. No words, just a single nod. But Grace understood. Something had been decided, and from that moment on, her life had taken a turn, one that would never, ever lead back. The next morning, as sunlight brushed the narrow window ledge of a small apartment perched above an old laundromat on Chicago's west side, Grace was jolted awake by a sharp, insistent knock. She sat up slowly, still in her worn cotton pajamas, her mind fogged by the chaos of the previous day. The images refused to fade: men in black suits, Aidan Callahan's glacial stare, the unexpected revelation of Mrs. Margaret's true identity. It all lingered like a strange dream. She wasn't sure she wanted to believe. The knocking came again. Louder this time. More deliberate. Grace grabbed a thin cardigan, slipped it over her shoulders, and padded barefoot to the door. Two men stood on the landing. One was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark skin and sunglasses that reflected her own startled face. The other was shorter, older, his hair silver, a cream-colored envelope in hand. They didn't need to introduce themselves. The quiet gravity surrounding them spoke louder than words. The older man stepped forward and held out the envelope. "Miss Grace Whitaker." She nodded. "Mrs. Callahan requests your presence for tea later this morning. The car is waiting downstairs. Please dress modestly and comfortably." There was no explanation. No option to decline, only an invitation cloaked in authority. Grace swallowed hard, a chill running down her spine, then nodded again, this time with more certainty. "I'll need 10 minutes. 25 minutes later, a sleek black SUV glided through tree-lined streets leading north, away from the city's noise. Grace sat in the back seat, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the passing blur of light and shadow, though her mind saw nothing. She wore a simple, pale blue dress beneath a beige cardigan, her face softly made up, hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. She didn't know why she'd been summoned, whether this was a reward or a reckoning, but one thing was clear from the moment she helped Margaret Callahan to her feet. She had stepped into a story with no way back. The car stopped before a tall iron gate guarded by two men in suits. Beyond it stood the Callahan estate, rising behind a grove of crimson maples, stately, yet not cold. The 3-story mansion carried the grace of old Europe: wide-arched windows, carved stone balconies, a roof of silvery tiles that seemed to hold the memory of storms and seasons. The front doors opened to a maid in a black uniform who led Grace across a marble-floored foyer, down a long corridor lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her every step, until they reached a glass door at the end of the south wing. "Please, Mrs. Callahan is waiting in the solarium." Grace stepped inside, and light flooded her vision. The glass-walled room opened like an octagonal sanctuary of sunlight within the old house filled with potted trees in ornate porcelain, ivy curling up the window frames, and the faint perfume of jasmine floating through the air. At the center, Margaret Callahan sat in a cream-colored wicker chair, dressed in a soft gray cashmere sweater, a fine porcelain teacup glinting in her hand. She looked up when Grace entered, her face brightening in the morning light. "You came," she said gently, as if greeting a long-lost friend. Grace approached slowly, her nerves taut. I don't know why I was invited." "Ma'am." Margaret set her cup down on the low wooden table and gestured to the chair opposite her. "Because you were the only one who didn't look at an old woman as if she were an inconvenience. And because you did it, expecting nothing in return." She paused, her gaze drifting beyond the glass, to where a small squirrel darted along the garden wall outside. "The world has changed, Grace. People are more polite, but far less kind. You're not like them." Then she turned back, her expression softening. "That's why I wanted to see you, to talk, to get to know you, and perhaps to make you an offer." Grace sat upright, her heartbeat quickening. From the calm steadiness in Margaret Callahan's eyes, she knew this was no simple invitation for tea. This was a beginning, a quiet prelude to something far greater and far more dangerous. than anything she had ever imagined. After the strange afternoon tea in the sunlit solarium of the Callahan estate, Grace returned to her small apartment with her mind still spinning from what had just unfolded. Mrs. Margaret had revealed nothing concrete, no clear offer, no explicit request, only gentle stories, knowing glances, and one final sentence as Grace stood to leave. Sometimes life opens doors without warning, and all we need is the courage to step through. That sentence played on repeat in Grace's mind all evening and into the next morning as she put on her coat to walk to Hayden's Prime to collect her final paycheck. Chicago in the early morning had a kind of false calm. The streets were slick with leftover dew. Buses hissed at every stop, and people hurried past with the weary rhythm of another workday. Grace walked quickly through the familiar blocks, a strange heaviness in her chest, though she had already decided to quit, though her only task left was to pick up an envelope of wages. Something inside her felt as though she were returning to a stage. She no longer belonged to a chapter of her life that was already closed. When she pushed open the restaurant's glass door, the soft chime above it rang as usual. But the air inside was different. Chelsea, wiping the bar, froze mid-motion, her eyes widening at the sight of Grace. Marcus, standing near the kitchen door with an empty wine tray in hand, raised an eyebrow. Smirking, Derek emerged from the back, and Grace could see the irritation flicker in his eyes even as he forced a polite, managerial smile. Miss Whitaker, I assume you're here for your paycheck." Grace nodded, keeping her voice steady. "Yes, just to collect last week's pay. I won't take up anyone's time after that." Derek turned away to fetch the envelope, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the dining room. In those few seconds, whispers began to ripple through the air like a cold draft. Chelsea sauntered closer, arms crossed, lips curling. "So, did the Mafia queen offer you 30-year-old wine yet? Or take you shopping in Milan?" Marcus chimed in. "Guess you won't have to work for tips anymore." "Huh. Just one good meal before the right old lady and boom, your life changes." Laughter broke out behind the bar. A new waiter leaned toward his coworker and murmured, "Is she the one the matriarch adopted? Or maybe the heir to the deli empire?" Grace didn't flinch, but something deep inside her twisted tight. She had never imagined that an act of kindness could become a punchline, that compassion could be twisted into something small and ridiculous. She could have shouted back, told them she hadn't known who Mrs. Brickett Callahan was, that she hadn't wanted anything, that she'd only helped a woman who had fallen on a cold marble floor. But she knew none of them would listen. They didn't care about truth. They only cared about shrinking others so they could feel a little larger themselves. Derek returned, holding out a pale yellow envelope. "Cash, as you requested," he said, unable to mask the disdain in his voice. "Good luck with your powerful new friends." Grace took it, nodded once, and said nothing. She turned and walked out, never looking back. The glass door closed behind her, sealing off the sound of muffled laughter inside. Outside, the wind was sharp but clean. She walked slowly down the street, one measured step at a time, as though shedding an old skin that no longer fit. She didn't know what awaited her now. But one thing she knew for certain, she was no longer the same girl. And no matter what anyone said, she would never again allow her kindness to be twisted into someone else's joke. Never. 3 days after Grace left Hayden's Prime, just when life seemed to be settling into a fragile calm, she was pulled once again into a storm she never saw coming. It began on a gray morning as she stood in her tiny kitchen making coffee, the old radio murmuring the weather report like it did every day. Her phone screen suddenly lit up, dozens of notifications flooding in. Messages, missed calls, emails, comments. Her name was everywhere, as if the entire city had just unearthed some shocking secret. Frowning, Grace unlocked her phone, opened the news app, and the world tilted beneath her feet. Splashed across the homepage of a notorious gossip site was a photo of her kneeling beside Margaret Callahan, helping her up. The image cropped perfectly, to make it look like she was whispering into the old woman's ear. The headline screamed in bold red letters, "The mysterious Waitress Callahan family's young lover or undercover spy." Grace froze. The photo had clearly been taken from the restaurant's surveillance footage, but it had been twisted into something else entirely. Beneath it was a torrent of online speculation, each comment more absurd than the last. Some claimed she was the Mafia heir's secret mistress, sent to watch over his mother. Others insisted she was an undercover FBI agent infiltrating the Callahan empire. A few even dug up her old college photo and pointed to a sociology research course she once took proof. They said that she was trained in espionage. More articles followed, labeling her a power-hungry seductress, the brunette spy, and worse, the mob boss's little girlfriend. Within an hour, the anonymous messages began. Threats, insults, obscene questions, propositions. Someone had found her personal email and even her private social media accounts that only a handful of people knew existed. Another post spread online, a photo of her apartment building with the caption, "Is this the secret hideout of the richest man's mistress?" Grace turned off her phone with trembling hands, her heart pounding so violently it felt ready to burst. She sank into a chair, clutching her head. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had simply helped an old woman who had fallen. She hadn't asked for money, favors, or recognition. And yet the city now called her names she never could have imagined. That afternoon, when she stepped outside to buy groceries, a car she didn't recognize pulled up at the end of the alley. A man she'd never seen raised his phone and snapped her picture without a word. When she asked who he was, he just smirked, revved the engine, and sped off. That night, someone threw eggs at her window. The glass didn't break, but the stench and humiliation lingered. She called the police. They took her statement but offered nothing more. Stuff like this usually doesn't go anywhere. "Miss Whitaker," the officer said, his tone weary. But for Grace, it was already too much. Sleep never came that night. The next morning, an unsealed envelope was slipped through her door. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting uneven and rushed. "Stay away from that old woman. You have no idea what you're getting into." Grace folded the note carefully, her eyes closed, her breath unsteady. She had never felt so small, so exposed. The apartment that had once been her safe haven now felt like a glass cage, watched from every direction. She knew then this was no longer just an online frenzy. Someone out there saw her as a threat, and they didn't only want to ruin her name, they wanted her gone. Grace had entered the world of the Callahans, but this time, it wasn't through an invitation to afternoon tea. It was through the shrill hiss of the media and the rancid scent of menace that clung to every shadow. And Grace understood, with chilling certainty, that no matter how much she longed to, she could never return to her old life again. Grace packed her things on a heavy, rain-soaked afternoon, while the low roar of the social media mob still would not subside, and her fear had long since passed any tolerable limit. After the night of thrown eggs and the anonymous threatening letter, sleep had abandoned her. Every small sound in the hallway jolted her awake, and nowhere felt safe anymore. On the fourth morning of that chaos, an envelope without a stamp was slipped beneath her door. Inside lay a single sheet of paper in Mrs. Priant, Margaret Callahan's elegant hand. "If you need a quiet place to breathe, my door is always open." There was no coercion, no further explanation. But that was all it took. Grace gathered what she needed into 2 large cloth bags, a few changes of clothes, a well-worn notebook, a handful of personal items. She left the apartment without looking back, without locking the door, as if that chapter of her life had already closed, and she no longer wished to hold on to any fragment of it. The familiar SUV met her at the end of the alley. The driver offered nothing beyond a curt greeting. The windows blacked out, the cabin soundproofed. Outside, long streaks of rain crawled down the glass like fingers trying to hold on to something slipping away. The ride lasted less than an hour, but in Grace's mind each minute stretched into an eternity. She did not know if she was doing the right thing. She only knew that staying meant she would not survive, and moving forward might mean she would never be able to return. The Callahan estate was as solemn as the first time she visited, but this time, it was not a stop for a few hours. It was to become her home. A maid led her to a small room on the second floor overlooking the southern garden. the wide window-framed maples turning deep red, and below, a curving stone path wound toward a still pond. The room was simple and warm, furnished with a mahogany bed, a modest bookcase, and a reading chair beside a lamp. Everything was spotless, orderly, not ostentatious yet, tended with meticulous care. But Grace soon realized that quiet did not equal absence of sound. On her first night, as she lay listening to the wind whistling past the window, she felt observed no footsteps, no shadow, only a primitive intuition rising in the silence. Each time she walked the corridor, there was the sense of doors gently closing behind her even when no one was there. In the kitchen, the chef glanced at her too quickly and turned away, as if fearful the look might be misread. One morning she saw a gardener watering the beds, and when she greeted him he only offered a slight nod, his gaze skimming her as if making an assessment. Invisible eyes pressed on her shoulders. Everyone in the house was polite, proper, but no one was truly warm. Their courtesy masked surveillance. Once she pulled a book from the shelf in the sitting room and a small scrap of paper fell out on it. In an unfamiliar hand. A sentence. "This room has ears." She folded the note into her pocket and felt her heart race. No one was there. But that did not mean no one knew. From that moment she spoke less, kept the phone unused for long stretches, avoided private messages in her room, and always carried her notebook to record anything important. Each action, each word was measured now, as if she lived inside an unspoken examination. Strangely, Mrs. Margaret continued to treat her with a kind intimacy, gentle conversation, the same invitations to tea, stories about the ancient maple in the garden, or youthful days in Venice. Yet never a word about the press, the threats, or the looks of the household. She behaved as though such things were passing clouds, and Grace only needed to stay until the storm passed. But Grace knew the truth. This was not a mere refuge but a trial by fire. And someone, perhaps many someones, watched to see if she would stumble, if she would reveal anything, or make the smallest misstep. Because in this world a single mistake could cost not only trust but a life. Aidan Callahan did not believe in coincidences. He had never allowed himself the luxury of letting emotion cloud his judgment, especially when it came to matters involving his family. Though Margaret, his mother, seemed utterly convinced by the quiet sincerity of the young woman named Grace Whitaker, Aidan was not so easily swayed. He had seen too many false faces, too many sweet words masking intent, too many people who drew close only to drain everything dry before disappearing, leaving behind nothing but damage and consequence. Once, he had nearly lost a brother because he trusted a woman who knew exactly when to cry. And so he understood kindness, whether genuine or rehearsed, was something that needed to be tested in his world. On Thursday morning, just after Grace left the reading room following a brief tea with Margaret, Aidan entered his private office at the west end of the estate. On the desk waited a black leather dossier, a steaming cup of espresso, and a small USB drive. The man who delivered them required no introduction. Thomas Reed, former intelligence operative, now employed full-time by the Callahans as the one who performed extended background checks on anyone who drew Aidan's attention. Aidan opened the file, scanning the first page. Full name: Grace Elizabeth Whitaker, born in Springfield, Missouri. Father killed in a federal truck accident when she was 8. Mother, a night shift nurse, dead from pancreatic cancer when Grace was 19. No siblings, no criminal record, average credit score, no outstanding student debt, employment history, bakery, supermarket, used bookstore, and most recently Hayden's Prime. He turned the pages slowly. Each line was precise and detached, as if Grace's entire life had been dissected under cold light. There were no dark corners, but no bright ones either. No politics. No activism. No public statements. The final section contained copies of recent articles, screenshots from social media, and a list of accounts spreading false stories about her. Thomas tapped a finger against the desk. She's clean. No link to any tabloid outlet. No suspicious transactions. No unexplained deposits. No sign she sought out your mother intentionally. If anything, she's too clean. The kind of clean that makes you think someone scrubbed the record for her. Aiden sat back in silence. He didn't believe in perfection. Everyone had shadows. The question was never if, but how well they hid them. He picked up the USB, plugged it in, and watched a 12-minute surveillance clip from 2 weeks earlier, Grace in her small apartment. Folding laundry, washing dishes, writing in a notebook, staring out the window, then pressing her palms to her face as if swallowing an ocean of exhaustion. He paused the frame, leaned back, eyes fixed on the screen but focused elsewhere. A part of him wanted to decide that Grace was simply a good person who had stumbled into an extraordinary moment. But another voice, the one that had kept him alive, whispered that maybe she was playing a long game. The kind of game even the sharpest minds could lose. He took a sip of espresso and gestured to Thomas. "Keep watching." From a distance. "No contact." Thomas nodded, gathered the files, and disappeared without a sound. Later that afternoon, while Grace sat by the lake reading, she lifted her head and caught sight of Aiden standing across the lawn, hands in his pockets. Gaze steady, not like a host watching a guest, but like a man weighing a chess piece before making his next move. They didn't speak. They simply looked at each other for a moment before he turned away, leaving her with the quiet, uneasy question that lingered long after. Had she just passed an invisible test or taken her first step into a labyrinth that had been waiting for her all along? Autumn drifted quietly across the grounds of the Callahan estate, the maples deepening from crimson to rust before carpeting the old stone paths. Grace had grown accustomed to the strange rhythm of life within these walls, a closed world where every step was observed, every word remembered. Yet, paradoxically, the only place where she had felt safe since her life had been torn apart under the flashing lights of the media. Within the hush of thick stone walls and meticulously arranged rooms, there was only one person who allowed her to breathe freely: Margaret Callahan. At first, their afternoon teas lasted no more than 15 minutes. Polite, small talk about the weather, the garden, or antique books. But one gray afternoon, when rain swept suddenly across the solarium and sunlight vanished from the glass, Margaret began to tell her about her first daughter. Her name was Evelyn, she said, eyes fixed on the misted sky. She was born in the coldest winter of 1958, a quiet child, but her eyes were astonishingly bright. I thought she would inherit everything. Her voice was not exactly sad, more a kind of fatigue stretched thin over the years. Grace sat still, her hands folded around a cup of tea gone cold. It was the first time Margaret had ever spoken of a child other than Aiden. When Evelyn was 16, she continued, she fell in love with a man the family would never accept. He didn't belong to our world. He didn't know how to bow his head. I didn't know how to keep silent. And then one night, Ed disappeared. Evelyn said nothing for 3 months, until the morning they found her by the lake. A letter still in her hand, never sent. Grace said nothing. There are griefs too sacred to answer. But in that silence, she understood why Margaret wore her composure like armor, why she needed control, why she had cherished Grace's unexpected kindness so fiercely. Since that day, Margaret said softly, eyes still on the gray sky, I stopped believing in innate goodness. Until you came along with coffee-stained hands and eyes that knew no fear. She turned then, placed her hand over Grace's elbow. I have lived too long among people who smile with agendas. But you remind me, the world still has a trace of gentleness left. From that day on, something between them shifted. It was unspoken. Yet Grace felt it in the way Margaret said her name, in the way she let Grace choose the music in the solarium, in the stories she shared that even Aiden had never heard tales of her youth in Venice, of sneaking away from a political gala to hear jazz, of how Mr. Callahan had proposed with a handwritten note tucked into a half-read book. And Grace, for the first time in years, felt herself belong to something larger than her own loneliness, not because of wealth or influence, but because someone truly saw her. One morning, as Grace brought in white roses from the garden to place by the solarium window, Margaret smiled faintly, as if the words had been waiting all along. You know, if Evelyn were alive, she'd be about your age. Perhaps she'd be the one adjusting my chair each morning, choosing the right tea for each kind of weather. Perhaps she'd be sitting beside me, just as you are now. Grace looked up, lips pressed together, unsure what to say. Yet something in her softened, sensing that an invisible emptiness inside Margaret was slowly being filled by these quiet mornings, by shared glances and unspoken understanding between two women bound by loss yet finding peace in each other's presence. And within that silence, something sacred began to take shape, not the bond of host and guest, nor duty or gratitude, but something close to maternal love, the kind that time and blood are not always required to define. That night, Grace stood before the tall mirror in her second-floor guest room at the Callahan estate, adjusting the strap on her shoulder and smoothing the deep blue silk that clung perfectly to her frame. The dress had arrived that morning without a sender's name, only a small card written in Margaret's familiar hand. "Tonight is a family dinner. I want you seated beside me." Grace's heartbeat quickened, though her time at the estate had taught her to live amid the presence of bodyguards, veiled scrutiny, and silences heavy with implication. This was different. Tonight, she was stepping into the Callahan family dining room, a place of lineage, power, and secrets, and she knew her presence. There was not an invitation. It was a test. The main dining hall stretched long and high-ceilinged, with crystal chandeliers, wine-colored wallpaper, and a walnut table running nearly the length of the room. Everything gleamed silver cutlery, hand-embroidered napkins, candles burning with quiet authority. Grace arrived early. Margaret was already seated at the head of the table, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "You look lovely," she said, patting Grace's hand as she sat down to her left. "Don't worry. It's just dinner." But Grace knew it was never just dinner. The others arrived minutes later. Aiden entered first, nodding to her without a word. Then came Claudia, the youngest sister of the late Mr. Mennett, Callahan accompanied by her husband, Tyler, a balding man with the steely eyes of someone tempered by years of politics and ruthless deals. Claudia, dressed in a tight black gown and a cloud of heavy perfume, wore disdain like a jewel. The moment her gaze fell on Grace, it carried open contempt. "So this is the girl you've been talking about," she said, half mocking, half curious, her eyes scanning Grace as if appraising merchandise. Grace only smiled politely. "Yes," Margaret replied before Grace could answer, filling her glass with wine. "And I've yet to meet anyone who brews tea as perfectly as she does." Tyler chuckled under his breath. "Well, tea's good. Every family needs someone to keep the cups warm through winter." The air tightened. Grace understood that to them she was not a guest but an intruder at a table meant for bloodlines. She said nothing, simply cut into her salmon with measured calm, while Claudia's star lingered. "You used to wait tables, didn't you?" Claudia asked bluntly. "I read some of those articles. One of them called you Aiden's mistress." Grace lifted her gaze to meet hers. Steady, unflinching. "Yes, I worked as a waitress. As for the articles, I can't control what people choose to believe. But I do hope that here, truth still matters more than rumor." Margaret laughed softly, approvingly. Aiden lowered his head slightly, concealing a brief, almost imperceptible smile. Claudia pressed her lips together and said nothing more. Tyler leaned back, arms crossed. "We're only looking out for Mother. A stranger appearing out of nowhere, especially now, makes questions inevitable." Grace nodded, her tone calm, free of bitterness. "I understand. And I don't expect anyone to trust me just because I'm sitting here. I only hope time will make its case." The dinner unfolded like a quiet duel, every word polite, every sentence edged. Grace endured it not with defiance, but with poise. She didn't need to prove herself. Her very presence at that table, beside the most powerful woman in the house, was proof enough. As the evening drew to an end, Margaret leaned toward her and whispered, her voice meant for no one else, "I know they think you don't belong. That's precisely why I believe in you more than any of them." Grace's lips curved into a small and genuine smile, the first of the night, because she understood now there would always be wolves at this table. but she had learned how to dine among them without fear. 2 days after the family dinner, the surface calm at the Callahan estate remained intact, but Grace could feel a thin, electric charge smoldering beneath every footfall and every glance. Margaret continued her afternoon teas with the same quiet steadiness, and Aidan maintained his usual, respectful distance. But in the wake of that night, Grace began to notice subtle shifts. Claudia stopped appearing in public. The household staff grew quieter, and unfamiliar faces started to drift through the back corridors. People who never looked her in the eye yet seemed to be everywhere she went. Late that night, sleepless, she padded down to the kitchen for a cup of herbal tea, bare feet on the long carpeted hall as the wall sconces threw long, trembling shadows. And at the west, turned toward the servants' stair, she heard a whisper. Instinct made her freeze and hold her breath. Voices filtered from the small conference room used for private family business, the door ajar and golden light spilling out. The first voice was sharp. "I hard as thorns, I told you. She's not just a joke. She's winning Mother over." It was Claudia. Grace stepped back, her heart pounding. A man exhaled and then spoke. "I never thought Margaret would go that far." But she's softening too quickly. Grace didn't need to look to know it was Tyler. He measured each word deliberately, as if calculating every syllable. If we let her stay, sooner or later she'll affect Aidan. And if both mother and son are for her, we have no voice left in this house. Claudia's voice dropped, but each word sliced like a blade. "I will not allow a waitress to wedge herself into our bloodline, not after all we built. Not after Evelyn is gone." Tyler was silent for a moment, then spoke in a flat tone that made Grace's skin crawl. "Then we manufacture a mistake. A lapse. A plausible reason to remove her without raising suspicion." Claudia's laugh was thin. "Nothing dramatic. Just make her lose trust. She hates betrayal, above all." Tyler agreed. "I know someone who can do it cleanly. Leave no trace. A few doctored files. A whisper at the right time." Glasses clinked as if they were toasting a scheme about to succeed. Grace retreated, careful not to creak the polished floorboards, and slipped back into her room with her heart still hammering. A dozen questions circled her mind. What would they do? How would they make it look like she had betrayed them? Would they plant false evidence or set an intricate trap? She knew that telling Margaret now might work. Maybe Margaret would believe her, but it might also plant suspicion. For Claudia was family and she was not. Sitting down, fingers clenched white on the armchair, she understood this was no longer ordinary jealousy. It was conspiracy. A purge dressed as protection. And she had become the danger in their eyes. But Grace was no longer the quiet waitress from the restaurant. She had seen the true face of power and heard how polite people discuss destroying another as casually as choosing wine for dinner. She knew she must be more careful than ever. And this time she would not sit idle waiting for disaster. She would prepare, because in the world of the Callahans there were only two kinds of people, players or sacrificial pawns. And Grace had made her choice. That morning began like any other at the Callahan estate. The air was crisp, sunlight threading gently through the fiery red maples in the garden. And Margaret had summoned Grace for an early tea in the solarium, their sanctuary of quiet within a world built on secrets and strategy. Yet, unlike their usual mornings, Margaret seemed distant, her eyes gliding across the newspaper without truly reading. Grace could sense it. Something heavy was stirring beneath the calm surface. She was just about to ask when the glass doors opened abruptly. Aidan entered, his expression taut, followed by two men in dark suits, strangers, silent and cold. Margaret raised an eyebrow and slowly set her teacup down. Aidan wasted no time. He looked directly at Grace, his voice low and stripped of warmth. "You'll need to go with them. There's something we have to clarify." Grace froze, forcing her pulse to steady. Clarify what? Aidan's gaze flicked toward his mother. Waiting. Margaret gave a slow nod. "Go on, dear. They only need to ask a few questions." Grace followed the men down to the lower level, a place used only for urgent family business. The room was sealed and sterile, its chill blending the scent of old wood with faint cigar smoke. On the table lay a thick file, and in its center, the familiar black USB she had once seen when Aidan investigated her. Another man waited across from her, silver-haired, glasses thin as wire. He introduced himself curtly, the family's internal legal advisor. Then he opened his laptop, projecting a security recording onto the wall. The footage showed a slender figure entering the archive room past midnight, unlocking a cabinet, and copying data from a hard drive onto a USB. Grace held her breath. The person wore a gray hoodie, moved confidently as if they knew the layout by heart. The image was grainy, but the build matched hers almost exactly. The lawyer's voice was calm, almost gentle, which made it worse. This isn't about what was taken, Miss Whitaker. It's about why and for whom. Some of the retrieved documents were restricted to high-level members only. They contained details about alliance meetings and private negotiations with other families. Grace started to speak, then stopped. She understood. This was the mistake. The planted oversight Claudia and Tyler had conspired to create. She was standing exactly where they wanted her framed, isolated, and utterly believable, as the traitor. "I didn't do this," she said clearly. "I've never seen those files. I've never gone into that room alone." The man's face did not shift. "Do you have a witness?" Grace swallowed hard. In this world, words were nothing. Only evidence mattered: records, fingerprints, or the protection of someone powerful enough to make the truth count. And right now, every one of those was against her. Aiden stood in the corner, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Grace turned toward him, eyes pleading. "You know I didn't do this." But he didn't answer. He only looked at her for a long moment before turning away. The questioning lasted nearly 2 hours. They asked about her nightly habits, her computer use, who knew her passwords. She answered every question precisely. But she also knew once trust fractures, truth no longer weighs enough to mend it. When it was finally over, the lawyer simply said the investigation would continue. Grace was escorted back to her room, not confined, yet not free. From that moment on, every door in the estate seemed to close a little tighter. On her way upstairs, she saw Claudia at the top of the staircase, a glass of red wine in hand, her lips curling into the faintest smile, a silent acknowledgement that she knew exactly what had just taken place. No words were needed. The look said everything. Grace turned away, her chest heavy. She didn't yet know how to prove her innocence, but she understood one thing with piercing clarity: if she didn't uncover the truth herself, they would succeed in erasing her from Margaret's life. And if that happened, everything she had endured would mean nothing. The following afternoon, the Callahan estate lay under a suffocating hush, the kind of silence that carried tension in every corner. Grace stayed in her room with the lights off, letting the last traces of daylight filter through the thin curtains, casting a fragile melancholy across the old wooden floor. She hadn't stepped outside since the interrogation ended, nor accepted any of the meal trays the staff brought to her door. Suspicion, she knew, was a stain that reason could never wash away. She had already been framed as a traitor, and though her conscience was intact, she understood better than anyone that truth often failed to save those crushed beneath the tilt of power. What she hadn't expected was Aiden's silence. It was that, more than anything, that hollowed her from within. Then, near 6 o'clock, a servant knocked softly and announced that Mrs. Lush Terriazardiase. Callahan wished to see her in the small conference room downstairs. Grace rose, her heart beating with anxious purpose. She didn't know if she was walking toward dismissal or condemnation, but she went anyway, drawn by a force beyond reason. When she entered, everyone was already there. Aiden stood by the window, his gaze unreadable. Claudia and Tyler sat across from each other, glasses of wine untouched before them. At the head of the table sat Margaret, composed as ever, though in her eyes gleamed a light that was different, hard, cold, and edged with danger. She didn't ask anyone to sit. A small gesture of her hand, and she turned to Aiden. "Play it." He inserted a USB into the large wall screen without a word. The footage flickered to life, black and white, wide-angled, not from any known surveillance feed. It showed the corridor behind the library, the precise moment the intruder had entered the records room. But this time, from a completely different angle, clearer, sharper, and when the hooded figure turned toward the camera, the face was unmistakable. It wasn't Grace. It was a man shorter, broad-jawed, thick-haired, the personal bodyguard of Tyler. The same one often seen standing behind him at family events. Tyler shot to his feet, face flushing. What the hell is this? Claudia's composure cracked, her lips twitching as if swallowing a curse. Margaret folded her arms, her gaze slicing through the air like glass. "What is it?" she repeated, her tone soft but lethal. "It's the game you two thought you could play with me." She signaled Aiden to freeze the frame there. In perfect clarity, the man's face exposed beyond denial. "That camera was installed years ago by my own hand. It's not part of the main system. It only activates when there's an unauthorized breach in the archive level." Her voice dropped, each word honed to a blade. "Did you really think I'd grown too old to recognize betrayal in my own house?" Claudia gripped the armrest until her knuckles whitened. Tyler tried for calm. "This could be fabricated. Technology these days enough." Margaret cut him off, her tone a whip. "Don't insult my intelligence further." Then she turned to Grace, and for the briefest instant, her eyes softened. "You don't have to say a word. Dear, the truth has spoken for you." Grace stood still, throat tight. For a moment it felt like waking from a nightmare she hadn't believed she could survive. Margaret looked back at Claudia and Tyler, her voice even, almost gentle, but cold as a winter lake. "From this moment, you are barred from all strategic meetings. Your access to internal systems is suspended, and if there is ever a second time, I will not stop at warnings." Claudia opened her mouth to protest, but one glance from Aiden silenced her instantly. The air in the room thickened until it was almost hard to breathe. When they were finally dismissed, Grace remained where she was, trying to grasp what had just unfolded. Margaret approached her, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. "Those who are genuine," she said quietly, "are always tested the harshest. But it's the strength you showed in silence that told me I was right about you." Grace nodded faintly, her eyes burning but dry. This wasn't a moment for tears. It was a moment to stand tall, to remember that truth could be twisted, hunted, nearly buried. Yet somewhere, it always found a place to live. And today, because one woman who'd long forgotten mercy chose to believe again, truth had won. 3 days after Claudia and Tyler's scheme was exposed, the air inside the Callahan estate still hadn't settled. Margaret spoke little about what had happened, yet every decision she made, every glance she cast, carried the sharpened precision of someone who had just cut a malignancy out of her own family. Grace had resumed her usual place beside her during private meetings, and though no one said it aloud, she understood it was silent recognition, a position earned, one not easily shaken. But with that trust came a heavier weight than ever before, because for the first time in years, a reconciliation summit among the region's most powerful families was being held, and the Callahans were hosting. The event took place in a secluded mansion north of the city, chosen for its isolation from the press and its labyrinth of layered security. Grace sat in an armored SUV with Margaret and Aiden. Margaret wore her customary simple black dress, though a thin gold bracelet on her wrist marked her as the evening's presiding figure. Aiden barely looked up from his phone, scanning live security updates. Across from them, Grace could feel her pulse quicken as the car passed through the gates, where guards checked every vehicle with meticulous care. Inside the mansion, the grand hall gleamed with chandeliers and marble fireplaces, a jazz quartet playing softly in one corner. One by one, the families arrived: Volkov, Giordano, Martinez, each carrying years of tangled history with the Callahans' alliances, betrayals, broken truces. No one fully trusted anyone, yet all knew that if no common ground was found tonight, the fragile peace between them could collapse into chaos. Grace followed Margaret like a shadow, attuned to every word, every handshake, every fractional lift of an eyebrow. She understood now that in this world, danger didn't come from gunfire, but from smiles that didn't reach the eyes. When the evening reached its toast and guests had settled along the long central table, Margaret took the head seat, Flanked by the other family heads, Grace sat a row behind. Beside Aiden, close enough to see everything. Her gaze moved slowly, assessing expressions, posture, tone. Then, just as a waiter refilled Aiden's wine glass, something in her peripheral vision froze her on the second-floor balcony. A crouched figure, hands gripping a long, concealed shape beneath a dark coat. Her heart sized. A rifle. Without thought, Grace shot to her feet, knocking over Aiden's glass. "Gunman!" she shouted. The warning cracked through the polished air like lightning. In an instant, Aiden lunged forward, shielding his mother as security converged on Margaret's side of the table. But Grace didn't stop. She sprinted toward the staircase leading to the upper hall, ignoring the calls behind her. She didn't know why it had to be her, only that someone had to go, and no one else had moved. The climb felt endless, each step pounding through empty space. The gunshot rang out before she reached the landing. Glass shattered into 1,000 fragments. Screams echoed below. Grace didn't hesitate. She raced toward the fleeing silhouette, glass slicing her bare skin as the wind knifed through the broken windows. The man turned, attempting to vault over the balcony toward the emergency exit. But she caught the edge of his coat and yanked him back. They crashed to the floor, struggling, the rifle clattering out of reach. In that split second of light and chaos, she saw his face, the security guard from the Martinez side, the one introduced briefly earlier that evening. Before he could recover, 2 Callahan guards slammed into him, forcing him down, wrists pinned amid a flurry of curses. Grace stood still among the glittering debris, chest heaving, blood running from a cut on her leg. Below, Margaret was unharmed, though the railing near her chair bore a fresh bullet groove. Aiden looked up, their eyes locking across the distance, and in his gaze was something Grace had never seen before. Not surprise, but something deeper, absolute trust. For the first time since stepping into this world of power and shadow, Grace no longer felt like an outsider. She was part of it now, not by blood, but by courage, the same courage that had once made her kneel beside an old woman no one else would help. Everything happened in seconds. Yet for Grace, each moment stretched into eternity. The instant her eyes caught the dark figure on the second-floor balcony, instinct had already recognized it, not an onlooker, but a sniper ready to pull the trigger. There was no time to analyze, no room for hesitation. She screamed a warning, but her body was already moving, legs propelling her toward Margaret, as though every nerve and breath within her shared a single command: protect the woman who had trusted her. The first sound was glass shattering, a short, razor-sharp crack that sliced through the fading music and polite laughter. The bullet tore from the upper floor, punched through the reinforced glass, now splintering under the pressure, and streaked straight toward the head of the table where Margaret sat. But Grace was faster. She shoved the chair hard, toppling it backward, and threw herself over the older woman in the same heartbeat. The bullet grazed inches above Margaret's head, striking a crystal decanter behind her and exploding it into a rain of shards amid the gasps and screams that filled the room. Glass flew everywhere. A jagged splinter lodged in Grace's shoulder, sending a hot stab of pain through her. But she didn't stop. Margaret fell back, pulled away by 2 guards, though her wide, stunned eyes found Grace's for one brief, searing second. Around them, chase erupted. Some guests dove for cover, others stumbled back in panic. But Aiden didn't move away. He moved toward them. He had seen everything from the first moment Grace stood. And when the shot rang out, he was already half a breath behind her. By the time he reached her, Grace was on the floor, blood soaking through the silk at her left shoulder, the shard of glass still glinting faintly beneath the fabric. He knelt beside her, voice low but charged with fear. "You're hurt. Don't move." Grace shook her head, breath ragged. "Is she safe?" Aiden glanced back. His mother was being escorted down the secure hallway, shaken but conscious. He turned again, nodding once. "She's fine. Thanks to you." The hall had dissolved into pandemonium. Guards fanned out, locking down exits as another team surged upstairs to track the shooter. Across the table, Members of the other families were rising, insisting they had no part in the attack, but no one was leaving. The doors were sealed, the mansion shifting into full lockdown. In that instant, Grace realized she had done more than save Margaret's life. She had become the living witness to an assassination attempt that could fracture the entire power structure of their world. She was no longer standing at its edge. She was at its center. Moments later, as private physicians arrived to tend her wound, Margaret returned, refusing to retreat to the armored car, despite every protest. She moved straight toward Grace, then unthinkably knelt before her. No one had ever seen Margaret Callahan kneel for anyone. She took Grace's hand and squeezed it tightly, her voice rough and trembling. "You saved my life." Again, Grace shook her head, weary, but lucid. "I just did what had to be done." Same as the first time. Aiden stood beside them, his gaze moving from his mother to Grace. In that look there was no suspicion. No test. No control, only respect. And something deeper, neither of them yet dared to name. The shard was removed, the wound bandaged. When the guards returned with the captured assailant, Grace pushed herself upright to see. The man bound at their feet was one of the Martinez security detail, his face stone cold, his eyes devoid of remorse. But that no longer mattered. Margaret was safe. The summit might continue. But the balance had shifted. Once again, the quiet courage of a woman everyone had underestimated had shaken the table where power itself was decided. No one could ignore her now. No one could ever call her an outsider again. Grace Whitaker had carved her place into that world with blood, with loyalty, and with a bravery no one had seen coming. That very night after the failed assassination at the Northern Mansion, Aiden ordered a full lockdown of all access logs and data from the scene, summoning the Callahan family's highest-level security unit to begin an emergency investigation. Margaret, though advised to rest, stayed awake through the night with her advisors in the old library, her gaze never leaving the glowing network map of alliances projected on the large screen. Grace was brought back to the Callahan estate for treatment, but her mind kept circling the same question: who would dare hire a killer to strike during a gathering that united every powerful family in the region, unless they were mad enough to believe they could get away with it? By morning, Aiden and Frank, his longtime right hand and overseer of the Callahans' covert external operations, entered the secure briefing room beneath the estate. On the table lay a folder of data extracted from the sniper's confiscated phone. A man claiming Martinez ties but carrying false credentials from a private security firm in Chicago. Frank turned each page, his face hardening with every line. "This isn't a typical third-party contract," he said, pointing at a string of payment codes buried under heavy encryption. "Whoever's behind this isn't just stirring chaos. He's sending a message." Aiden stood motionless, both hands braced against the table, his cold eyes fixed on the printed thread of messages. "What message?" Frank answered without pause. "That Margaret Callahan is no longer untouchable." Hours later, a decrypted video from the shooter's device revealed an encrypted call, the voice digitally distorted. But what made Aiden's jaw tighten wasn't the sound. It was the reflection caught in the caller's glasses. A ring, a black onyx band carved with a Celtic dragon motif, a design owned by only 3 people in the Callahan bloodline. One was the late Mr. Callahan, the second was Aiden himself, and the third was Tyler. Without a word, Aiden signaled Frank to follow him upstairs to the 3rd-floor data core, where the estate's internal servers stored every metadata trace of secured calls made within Callahan-controlled zones. Each encoded transmission was logged by duration and frequency, never by content, but enough to trace when needed. Within half an hour, they had founded a 19-minute call, originating from the private guest lodge on the eastern edge of the estate, Tyler's usual quarters whenever he came home. Frank opened a second folder, this one detailing the account linked to the shooter's transactions. Though laundered through 3 layers of digital wallets, the original transfer led back to a trust fund in the Cayman Islands tied to a shipping front in which Tyler had held quiet shares, a company Aiden had warned him to cut ties with years ago. Frank exhaled sharply. "That's enough to hang him." Aiden nodded, his expression now stripped of hesitation. "Call my mother. She needs to hear it herself." When Margaret entered the library, The morning light was beginning to slip through the frosted glass. Aiden laid out the findings concisely. She listened without interrupting once. When he placed the ring on the table, the very one seen reflected in the video, she closed her eyes for several seconds before opening them again. The fury was gone. What remained was a quiet, heavy sorrow, belonging to someone long accustomed to betrayal. "I thought he was only ambitious," she said slowly. "But it seems Tyler is far more foolish than I imagined. He doesn't understand that what he's trying to seize was never his to claim, not even if he burned this entire family to the ground." Frank remained silent, while Aiden finally asked, "What do we do now?" Margaret rose and walked toward the window. "Bring him here," she said. "No warnings. No pretense. We'll speak as family one last time." And in that moment, Aiden understood with absolute clarity this was no longer a conflict between past and present. It was a reckoning to decide who truly deserved to inherit the future of the Callahan name. The Callahan family's private council chamber was thick with tension as Tyler was escorted inside, his hands unbound but flanked closely by two imposing men. He still carried that same air of arrogance, his gray suit pressed to perfection, his stride unshaken, even though he surely knew what awaited him. Margaret sat at the head of the mahogany table, her silver hair neatly pinned back. No hat this time, her fingers interlaced before her. Aiden and Frank stood behind her, while Grace sat slightly to the side, her shoulder wound bandaged, but her face still pale. She didn't take her eyes off Tyler, the man who had once smirked while she was accused, who had raised a wineglass at the dinner table as though nothing mattered, and who now stood revealed as the one behind the bullet meant for the woman she most revered. Tyler spoke first, his voice dry as gravel. "I don't need a lawyer. If you've called me here, Mother, it means the decision's already been made." Margaret didn't answer right away. She studied him for a long moment, not with anger anymore, but with the quiet, hollow disappointment of a mother watching the last remnants of her child's decency fade away. From the drawer, she retrieved a black onyx ring and placed it on the table. "Do you remember what this is?" she asked. Chula still silent. Her voice remained steady. "It's the ring your father gave me when I took his place. He trusted me, and I trusted you. And you've betrayed us both." Tyler's eyes flickered but showed no remorse. "I did what needed to be done," he said coldly. "You've let a waitress cloud your judgment. You're not the leader you once were. I protected this family the only way I knew how." Margaret gave a short, sharp laugh, cutting his glass. "By hiring a sniper to kill your own mother in the middle of a summit. By making the entire underworld believe the Callahans have turned on themselves." She tilted her head, her gaze piercing through him. "You didn't protect this family, Tyler. You protected your pride and your hunger for power." Silence pressed down on the room. Aiden's fists tightened, but he said nothing, letting his mother speak. Margaret rose from her chair and stepped toward Tyler. She wasn't tall, but up close she seemed monumental, like judgment itself made flesh. "You are my blood," she said quietly, "and for that reason, I will not stain my hands again." Tyler's brow furrowed. "So what?" "Exile," she nodded. "I strip you of every right within this family shares. Assets. Authority. Your name will be erased from every record. You are no longer a Callahan." Tyler froze. In their world, death was often lighter than exile. To be erased from the family name was to be cast into the void. No protection. No power. No identity. "You have 3 days to leave the city," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, but her eyes as sharp as a blade. "After that, if you're found within our territory, I will not grant mercy a second time." She stepped back. "You chose this path. Tyler, I'm only walking you to its end." Tyler said nothing. He stood tall, his gaze sweeping once over Aiden before landing on Grace. For the first time, there was something almost human in his expression, not guilt, but acknowledgement. He knew he had lost. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the door. With every step, the oppressive weight in the room seemed to lift, piece by piece. When the door closed behind him, Margaret sank back into her chair, her shoulders suddenly heavy, her face lined with exhaustion that made her seem years older in an instant. She looked around the table, her voice low but resolute. "We may lose many things," she said, "but the worth of this family will never be measured in blood." Grace reached for her hand and squeezed gently. Margaret gave her a faint, weary smile, one that still held strength. In a world where betrayal was usually repaid with death, Margaret Callahan had chosen to preserve the last fragment of humanity left within her. Not because she was weak, but because she understood that true leadership did not mean being heartless, and that choice compassion over cruelty made her, in the eyes of everyone there, and especially Grace, the strongest woman they had ever known. A week after Tyler's exile from the family, the air within Callahan Estate seemed to still not from fear, but from rebirth. The tension that once clung to the corridors had lifted. No more urgent midnight meetings. No more whispered suspicions drifting behind closed doors. In their place came something quieter. Steadier the sight of Grace by Margaret's side. No longer as a favored outsider, but as someone whose place in the heart of the family's power could no longer be denied. And then, on a warm Sunday afternoon, Margaret summoned an official gathering of the Callahan Inner Circle. A meeting held only when history itself was about to shift. Every senior member was required to attend in the Great Hall, where portraits of the ancestors loomed high on the walls, and the colored light streaming through stained glass windows cast a solemn, almost sacred glow across the room. Grace was the last to be called in. She wore a simple, elegant dress, no heavy makeup, her hair neatly tied back, and on her wrist, a small watch Margaret had given her the day she officially moved into the estate. As she entered, she was no longer the waitress from Hayden's prime, no longer the woman battered by rumor and suspicion. She walked tall, calm, though her eyes shimmered with emotion she couldn't quite hide. Margaret sat at the head of the table, flanked by Aiden, Frank, and the elder members of the family. Rising to her feet, she raised a hand for silence, before speaking, her voice clear and firm. "Today, I have not gathered you to discuss strategy or crisis. Today, we speak of something far greater than power or reputation. We speak of family." The room went utterly still. Margaret looked at Grace, then turned to the others. "Grace Whitaker, the woman who has saved my life twice, who has endured trials and suspicion, none of you here have ever known, will from this day forward be recognized as my legal daughter." A ripple of startled whispers passed along the table, but no one dared interrupt. "This is not out of pity," Margaret continued, "nor sentiment. It is because in her, I have seen the values upon which the Callahan name once stood: loyalty, courage, and compassion." Aiden's gaze lingered on Grace, quiet but shining with something new. Margaret went on. "All legal proceedings have been completed. From this day forth, Grace will bear the Callahan name. She will hold an official position within the family structure, protected, respected, and granted authority within the bounds I define." Turning toward her, Margaret stepped forward and handed Grace a small wooden box. Inside lay a ring engraved with a daffodil, the symbol reserved only for those of the bloodline. Grace took it in trembling hands, her eyes meeting Margaret's. I don't know what to say." Margaret smiled, one of those rare, tender smiles that softened the years etched into her face. "Just say you're ready." Grace nodded, barely, yet the motion felt like a vow. Silent but unbreakable. "I'm ready." One by one, the room rose. Following Aiden's cue, the elders inclined their heads in assent. No more dissent, no more doubt. Grace Callahan was no longer a bystander in a world she once feared to enter, and as the multicolored light from the stained glass washed over her, she understood that her life had turned a page not into peace, but into purpose. The challenges ahead would be many, yet for the first time, she would not face them alone. After the formal announcement, the name Grace Callahan began to appear in the family's internal documents, from meeting transcripts to strategic consultation schedules. Yet beyond the ink of a new surname, her presence began to take root in conversations that truly mattered. Not because she bore the legal title of Margaret Callahan's adopted daughter, but because those who had seen her act in moments of crisis now recognized that she possessed not only loyalty but an unclouded mind, a rare ability to see what others, even veterans of the game, often overlooked. At first, her role was purely observational. Margaret allowed her to sit in on meetings but never asked her to speak. That changed one afternoon during a review of profit distribution across the eastern branches. Grace quietly pointed out a discrepancy in the data that had gone unnoticed by the senior accountant. She didn't just identify the problem. She proposed a solution that optimized the flow of funds without raising suspicion among dependent subgroups. Margaret said nothing at the time, but after the meeting, she called Grace into the library and, for the first time, handed her an unprocessed file, asking her to study it and return with recommendations within 2 days. From that moment, a new position emerged within the estate, an unofficial title, but one everyone understood. Margaret Callahan's private advisor. No nameplate, no office. Yet every new proposal Margaret presented in recent months had already passed through Grace's hands. Aiden kept his distance at first, his natural caution still intact. But that changed after Grace publicly defended his position during a heated debate with a group of partners from Texas. From then on, his gaze carried a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. Frank was more direct. Before difficult negotiations, he often sought Grace out, asking her to listen and share her impressions. "You have ears for the things people don't say," he once told her after she exposed the real motive of a broker pretending to be neutral. Gradually, those who once saw her as an outsider began consulting her before making key decisions. The household staff stopped calling her Miss Grace and began addressing her as Miss Callahan. The guards, who once kept a polite distance, now bowed slightly when she passed. It wasn't fear, it was respect. Respect for the woman who had dared to stand, to endure, and to change. Margaret, growing wearier from age and the scars of past battles, began entrusting more to her, from reorganizing the Western supply chain to overseeing alliance meetings. On late nights, the two of them would sit by the fireplace reading old reports. As Margaret shared stories never written down of deals struck in car back seats, promises sealed in blood, and friends who had fallen because they hesitated 1 second too long in a world without mercy. Grace listened, not merely to understand, but to remember, to piece together the vast mosaic of power she was now part of. She never tried to replace Margaret. She didn't want to. But step by step, she became her second pair of eyes, her second set of ears. And at times, the living heart that still felt within a system slowly corroding under ambition. Aiden, though still a man of few words, had come to trust her completely beside his mother. In a rare moment of candor, he murmured to Frank after leaving a meeting, "If I ever run this family one day, I want her sitting next to me." Frank only smiled faintly, offering no reply, but his eyes told the rest. Grace was no longer the woman who once knelt to help an old lady fallen on the marble floor while others laughed. She had become the kind of woman who could walk into a room full of cold minds and make them listen with a single, well-timed sentence. The Callahans already had an heir by blood. Now, they had one by choice and by heart. And to many within those walls, that was a legacy far more enduring than blood itself. Night settled gently over Callahan Estate. The warm golden light, spilling from its tall windows, made the mansion appear to float within its own world, a world where power, memory, and loyalty intertwined, like invisible threads. On the balcony of the second floor, overlooking the garden in full bloom, Grace stood with a cup of steaming tea in her hands. Beside her, Aiden approached quietly, saying nothing, only standing close enough for her to feel his presence. Solid and wordless, neither spoke a greeting. After all they had endured, words were no longer necessary. Aiden's gaze rested on the face of the woman who had once been a stranger. Once, a small-town waitress, and was now someone strong enough to stand as an equal among those who believed they controlled fate. Grace smiled, no longer shy, her voice soft as the evening breeze brushing against the eaves. "Do you think she'll hand everything over to you soon?" she asked. Aiden nodded slightly. then turned to her with an expression that carried both sorrow and quiet gratitude. Maybe. But without you, everything would have fallen apart long ago. Grace met his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't look away. In that gaze lay recognition, understanding, and something deeper that neither dared to name. There was no need for a kiss or confession. The silence between them, full of trust and unspoken connection, said more than any words ever could. Grace's story was a journey of defiance against prejudice, against pain, and for the courage to live by the quiet strength of kindness and conviction. She did not become a Callahan through ambition or manipulation, but because she chose to stand for what was right, even when everyone else turned away. One simple act, kneeling to help an old woman when the world around her laughed, had opened a door no one expected. But what mattered most was that no matter how high she rose, Grace never lost herself. She remained the same, sincere, steadfast, and true to the reason she began. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson her story leaves behind, that some families are not born of blood, but of choice, trust, and love. These bonds, forged in understanding rather than lineage, are often the strongest of all. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever walked past someone in need, thinking your help was too small to matter? Or have you ever been misunderstood simply because you chose to act differently from the crowd? Grace's journey could be yours. Mina, or anyone's who tries to stay kind in a world that doubts goodness. Share your thoughts and feelings about this journey. In the comments below, we would love to hear from your heart. If you found meaning in Grace's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so that more people can find inspiration. The YouTube channel Underworld Love Stories will continue to bring you heartfelt, profound, and deeply human tales every day. Stay with us as we explore more of the quiet beauty and unexpected truths of life. Thank you for watching till the end. Wishing you health, peace, and happiness. May your days be light and your heart full. See you in the next story.